You spend a lifetime building something too large to lose. You crossed deserts, rivers, and mountains no army before you had ever crossed. Then, on an ordinary afternoon in a palace that was never built for you, a fever starts. 12 days later, the largest empire the world has ever seen has no one left standing at its center. What actually killed him? His name was Alexander. By 30, he had shattered the Persian army at Gaugamela, taken Egypt, and pushed his soldiers to the banks of the Hyphasis River in India. Cities surrendered before he even reached their gates. His own men finally refused to march any further. He turned back, furious, but he turned back. Wasn't he supposed to be the one person nothing could stop? In June of 323 BCE, Alexander was resting in Babylon, inside a palace built generations earlier for Nebuchadnezzar. New campaigns were already being planned. Then after a night of heavy drinking with a companion named Medius of Larissa, something changed. A fever came on fast, and it did not go away. Ancient historians pieced together what happened next from court records called the Royal Diaries, used by both the historian Arrian and later Plutarch. Day by day, the fever climbed. Alexander stopped eating. He stopped speaking. His soldiers, terrified their king might already be dead, demanded to see him. So his men carried him past the entire army, one soldier at a time, each one searching his face for some sign he was still inside it. He could only move his eyes or lift a hand. What does it do to an army, watching a man they believed could never be beaten, unable to lift his own arm? 12 days after the fever began, Alexander was dead. He was 32 years old. When his officers asked who should inherit his empire, Arrian says he answered only two words: to the strongest. Within days, the empire he had spent 13 years building started tearing itself apart between the generals, who had stood beside him the whole way. Nobody performed a medical examination on his body. That was not how death was investigated in the ancient world. Everything that survives comes from descriptions and rumor, written decades after he actually died. And that is where the story stops being simple. One theory says poison. Ancient writers pointed at Antipater, the regent Alexander had left in charge of Macedon, and at his son Cassander, whose own brother, a cupbearer named Iolaus, allegedly served Alexander his final cups of wine. Legend claimed the poison came from the river Styx, so corrosive it could only be carried in the hoof of a mule. Plutarch dismissed the rumor outright. Other historians recorded it as fact. Doesn't that tell you it carried real weight at the time? A second theory blames disease. Babylon sat near marshland, and malaria and typhoid fever were both common there. A third theory blames the wine itself, worsened by grief after the death of his closest companion Hephaestion months earlier. Then in 2019, a researcher named Catherine Hall at the University of Otago proposed something stranger than any ancient theory. She pointed to a detail recorded by Plutarch. Alexander's body reportedly showed no signs of decomposition for 6 full days after he was declared dead. At the time, people took this as proof he was divine. Hall suggested something else. What if he simply wasn't dead yet? Her theory points to Guillain-Barré syndrome, a disorder that can cause paralysis to creep through the body while the mind stays fully conscious. Under this theory, Alexander's breathing may have grown so shallow it went undetected, while everyone in the room had already declared him gone. If Hall is right, his physicians did not fail to explain his death. They may have simply gotten the moment of it wrong by several days. There is no test left to run to settle any of this. No body has ever been found to confirm a single theory because Alexander's tomb, one of history's most searched for burial sites, vanished from the historical record more than 1,000 years ago and has never been located. Every theory, the poison, the fever, the grief, the paralysis, stands today exactly as it stood in antiquity, unconfirmed. What remains is the account of a man once considered untouchable, who spent his final 12 days unable to speak, surrounded by people who could not agree on what was happening to him even as it happened. Was he aware of it all? Did he understand his empire was already starting to fracture before his own body had even finished failing? You spend a lifetime believing that the things you build are the safest part of you. Alexander spent his final 12 days discovering that the body underneath all of it was never as untouchable as everyone, including the man himself, had always assumed. And more than 2,000 years later, nobody has ever been able to prove exactly when or why that body finally gave out.